So
Yes.
today we are going to talk about pulling more clues. Cues. I
Clues.
was going to say cues, like a cue
Hey,
ball,
that
but
works too.
that might work. So let me try that again. Today, we're going to talk about pulling more clues out of genealogy records.
Yes.
And I have already put a link to your blog post, how to pull all the clues from a genealogy source. I put that in the description box. So if you're watching this live or the replay, you can grab that, go to the description. And where do you want to start? Where do you think is one of the things that we're not doing that we probably should get more clues out of our records? And just so you know, I also have a census record and a deed record. If we want to do a little show and tell, we can do that too, because it would be kind of fun to put you on the hot seat.
Yes. Yeah. So I think one of the things that we don't do enough, and I'm including myself in this, because we find a record and we get so excited because, hey, it's going to give us that piece of information that we were looking for. So what do? We skim that document, we pull out that one little fact that we were looking for, and we kind of let the rest of it go. And we really do need to take a minute and actually read the whole record. I know that sounds, completely, pedantic and, and everything, but, okay, so you have the census pulled up. Perfect example. What do we do with the census? We're looking at the names of everybody in the household, and we're looking at, maybe their ages and their gender, maybe their occupation. But are we looking at everybody in total? Are we looking at the neighbors, like the person living next door? Do they happen to have the same surname? Is it a surname that you have seen in other records with that family that you've been researching? And looking, if you could scroll over a little bit to look at the birthplaces.
Yeah, of everyone in general, or the key family? Because I was focusing on this family.
Yeah, well, either way.
Okay, sure.
Now, as we're looking at, okay, so this entire family is born in England, but if you look at the family right below them, the head of household and another person is also born in England. So
Mm-hmm.
if you didn't have a really good idea of where in England your family was from, well, you have a bunch of other English people in this immediate neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
Did they all migrate together?
So there's another set of neighbors from England.
Exactly. And there was somebody in there who was very specific, was what, Isle of Jersey. So, that's something really.
Oh, yeah. This one right
Isle
here.
of Jersey, we have Wales. And also, looking at, okay, so that household is a really great example because he's born, the head of household born Isle of Jersey. She's born in Wales. The oldest child is born in Utah.
Mm-hmm.
So putting all this information together, we can get a pretty good idea of when the presumably husband and wife, when they came to the United States.
Mm-hmm.
If 3-year-old Mary A is their daughter and she's born in Utah in 1867, well, that's giving you some bookends of when they came to the United States, and more specifically, when they made their way out to Utah.
True.
So
Such
really
a good tip.
Yeah, so taking that time, and when we have even more complex documents, I mean, it's pretty straightforward to do with the census because everything is nice and in columns and everything. But when we get into something more complex, like a will or a deed or a pension file, when it gets to be a longer document, yeah, it's a little daunting to sit there and, read this entire deed.
For sure.
But there is so much information besides just who is buying and selling the land.
True.
Right?
Very true.
So really take the time to read the whole document, which brings me to my second tip that we should do with everything that we're doing, and that is identifying all of the people in that document.
Right.
And identifying all of the places that are mentioned in that document. Because looking at something, very complex like a deed, it could very easily be mentioning neighbors.
Right, for sure.
It could mention who previously owned that land or how that person had obtained that land.
Mhm.
it very often will mention the residence of both the grantor, the seller, and
Mhm.
the grantee, the buyer.
True.
So be
Yeah.
pulling out all of these places, all of these names, and think about, okay, how does this person fit in with the people that I'm researching?
Mhm.
You know.
True. And I'm looking at this document here. So we have a buyer, William Mulford, and it does say here where he was from.
Mhm.
And then it says Joseph Bonnell and Stephen Townley, executors of C. Townley. And
Mhm.
then when you look in further, it says that there's a guardianship of a younger Townley, the
Mhm.
children of Mr. Townley. And so you're starting to see a
Yes.
whole lot of clues right there in
Exactly.
this record. And then I did do extra research, and Charles is a younger child, and there's other children, Fanny, Charles, George, and Richard, all
Mhm.
named in this document. So you've got family, you've got executors, you've got a neighbor, and this is not in the meets and bounds. No, this is in the meets and bounds section. How many rods, and here's the neighbor, and how many rods, and here's the
Mhm.
neighbor. And like you said, there's just so many names in this document. It's insane.
Yeah, and something else to think about when we're reading the entire document, when we see these terms like, okay, he's the executor, well, what does that mean? Okay, and so if you're not familiar with what an executor is, okay, finding out what an executor is, it's somebody who is taking care of a probate matter. So that triggers, well, if he's an executor and there's probate, I should probably be following up with some probate records.
Mm-hmm.
And so, making sure that you are really understanding the terms that are being used in that document, because it can actually prompt you to think about other places to look for more stuff. Very
True. And
technical term there, stuff.
I guess, I heard you say probate. Did you also make court records?
Mhm.
Because maybe there's some court records going on, particularly since there's going to be children, and that's going to be guardianship records.
Right.
Is that right?
Exactly. And then that also takes you to that step of understanding, okay, well, if there's guardianship involved, what court handles that? Because
Right,
that's
for
going
sure.
to vary, from state to state and from state to state and time period to time period, what court or what entity handles things like
True.
guardianships. Mhm.
True. Very
Yeah.
true. Life is very active. I don't know if you hear the door going in and out. We've got lots of people home because we were all kicked out of school and work. So I do apologize for that background noise.
No worries at all yeah, that's great. That's
I,
great.
I think COVID has made us all be very more kind to
Yes.
the life of us YouTubers for sure. Oh, let
Yeah.
me take a quick moment to let you
Yes.
guys know who are watching this live or the replay. Amy Johnson Crow is also on YouTube now. I will put a link to her channel in the chat just in a minute, but it is in the description. Genealogy with Amy Johnson Crow. She's putting out. How often do you put out videos, and what is your aim with that channel?
Yeah, right now I'm publishing once a week. In fact, I had a new video come out this morning. Really a lot of what, if you're familiar with what I've been doing on my blog and the podcast, really showing people how they can make more discoveries in their family history, making genealogy and family history very approachable, very accessible. And like you say, Devin, have some fun with it. Because if it's not fun, why are we doing it?
So here's her channel. And are you looking at answers just in the wrong way? Well, that's going to be a really excited one for us to all go watch here in just a moment. But I have the link in the chat. I have the link in the description if you're watching the replay. All right. So what is the next tip? So we need to grab all the names. If I'm remembering correctly, grab all the names, slow down and look to find words, and look around at other things that are taking place on a record, particularly maybe city directories, census records, those kind of records where you're seeing the neighbors.
Yes.
What else should we be doing?
Well, we also need to stop and think about the actual source that we're using.
Okay.
First of all, are we using an actual record, or are we using an index to the record?
Okay.
And I see so many people do this. It's so easy to jump on Family Search, jump on Ancestry, and you stop at the results page, or you click through and you get what's basically an index or an abstract of that record rather than clicking through and looking at the actual record.
So you're saying this section is where people stop,
Yep.
and maybe there's a little thumbnail. Maybe not. Maybe it's an index to a collection on a different website.
Right.
You're saying we stop here when we need to go to the actual image.
Yes, exactly. Okay. Because as wonderful as the index is, and it really helps us get into these records, there's often so much more detail in the actual record rather than what is just on essentially the results page.
True.
And when you're looking at an entire census page, you get these clues that who are the neighbors around them. You really don't see that when you're just looking at that results page. Plus, you always have the issue of, was everything indexed correctly? We all have horror stories of how we've seen our ancestors' names butchered in some of the indexes. It's like, how in the world did they read it that way?
Right. Like, for instance, this one right here, what letter is that? Mary E. What is that?
I mean, looking at that, I'm almost thinking it's a stylized S.
Okay.
I don't think it's a J because it's not the same as James, a couple lines down.
True. So yes, see, so that's the next tip is when you're struggling with words, comparing letters across the pages.
Yeah, so I would look around, and this is another thing we need to do to pull out more clues when we're looking at something like this, and it also does not fit the same as the Y, or I'm sorry, as the L in Lycurgus, which was down there in household. I mean, Lycurgus Johnson. I wish that he was my ancestor because that's a great name.
Yeah, for sure, right?
Right. But looking around at, is there something else I can compare this to, something that is known that will help me figure out what the heck is that letter?
Right, for sure. For sure. And not using records in isolation. So this is 1870. We would want to look at 1880 because but she's 29 right now. So she could be in 1860 if I'm correct. And then she would be in 1880 and maybe would get a clue. So we can't use the records in isolation. Is that correct?
Exactly. Okay. And we also need to be careful to not read just one section of a record just by itself. I see this a lot in Facebook, in genealogy Facebook groups, that somebody will post a word and they'll say, well, what does this say? It's like, well, what type of document are we even looking at here? There was an example I saw a couple of days ago. It was actually from the 1880 census. And one of the columns in the 1880 census asked about disabilities.
Yes.
And there were actually several women who had this notation in their 1880 census. But the original person who posted this on Facebook, they only had just the two words. They just screenshotted those two words. And people were like, femoral problems, femoral, and it's like female problems.
Oh.
and somebody's like, oh, well, no, they were using the word femoral back then. And I'm like, wait a minute. So finally the person posted the entire, because at that point, nobody even knew what kind of document this came from. And I'm like, think about this for a second. This is the 1880 census. This is not information being given by a doctor. This is information being given by somebody in the household or maybe even one of the neighbors.
True.
They're probably not using the word femoral in this. But, they're probably saying, female problems as a euphemism for something going on, with, some sort of gynecological problem.
True.
But
very true.
Yeah, think about the record and how it would have been created. True. And why it would have been created. So.
And one of the people in our chat just a minute said, hey, did you see that the person was a matchmaker in 1870? And followed up and said, I saw a matchmaker and thought dating. And you know what? I did too. But then you have to stop and go time and place. Maybe they really were a matchmaker of dating, but maybe they actually made matches.
Yeah, I mean, and think about that. Yeah, we have matchmakers, but how many matchmakers were 48-year-old men. Yeah, seriously, I mean, I don't think that matchmaking was typically a male profession. And
True.
considering that they're in Utah, that there are, that there are minors, there are all sorts of things. I'm actually leaning more towards that he was making physical, strike a match, that sort
True,
of thing.
true.
That would be
Oh, and
fascinating to
here's
follow
that
up on.
column in 8 I'm sorry, didn't mean to interrupt, but
No,
you're
it's
right.
fine.
I was just saying, oh, look, they have that, deaf, dumb, and blind, insane, and idiotic column in the 1870s, and that
1870.
brings us to another thing. So you were talking about female problems,
Mhm.
but if we try to say he was idiotic, in 2020 eyes, that would be extremely offensive, and yet here's words that they used in their context. So
Yeah.
how do we treat words what we find in records that seem culturally insensitive today, but that's what they used in the past? What do you say?
Well, I mean, we have to record it as it was.
Okay.
We also need to take a step and realize even there that there are clues in those terms.
Okay.
Because I'm thinking more in the 1880 census where they actually had a differentiation between idiotic and insane.
Oh, that's a good
That
point.
that they were actually, and I would have to go back and look at the
Right.
enumerator's instructions, but
Right.
one of them was for someone who had, their mental faculties had really never developed,
Okay.
and the other was for somebody who had lost their mental
Okay.
faculties.
That makes sense.
Yeah, so even that, then understanding, okay, if this is a person who they lost their mental faculties later in life, okay, was it Alzheimer's?
Mhm.
Had they had a stroke? Was
Right.
it PTSD? Are we dealing with a veteran and now, later in life he's dealing with some of those issues? So even something like that can give us clues to follow up on.
True. And Chris just had a comment. He said sometimes in Italian documents, you see the word that looks like idiot, which could mean idiot, but it could also probably mean illiterate. So
Mhm.
not only do you need to know what you're reading within your own language, if you have to go across languages, you
Yes.
have to really understand their context as well, which makes
Yes.
genealogy definitely hurt your brain on
Yeah,
sometimes.
exactly, exactly.
For sure, for sure. There's one other thing that I read in your article, I believe. Let me pull it up here. Yeah. So we also need to pay attention to what's happening on the document, like how is it
Yes.
recreated, who does it recreated? Because I know I was indexing the 1950 census and
Mhm.
people were in alphabetical order, and I thought, well, that's kind of odd.
Yeah.
And then when I went up to the top, one time it was a nunnery. I was actually indexing a nunnery,
Oh,
or
okay.
it's not a nunnery. Sorry.
Convent. Try a convent.
Thank you, convent. That's what I meant. Um, Sometimes your brain flies during
Hey,
live
yeah,
shows,
and it's
but
Friday,
and so a convent. Thank you. One time it was a prison. One time it
Mhm.
was a hospital, and then the fourth time I indexed or did the get involved at, it was a college. So it was everybody in that particular dorm, and they alphabetized everyone. I think
Mhm.
somebody had a master list,
Yeah.
and then they just went copy, 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 copy,
Yeah.
copy.
Yeah, you do see that a lot in institutions that,
For
it
sure.
and if they're doing an enumeration in a prison or a hospital, they're not going cell to cell. They're just, contacting the warden and just getting the information from there is
True.
is usually what they would do.
True.
But yeah, but you do bring up a very good point that we really do need to stop and think about the records that we're using, how they were created, why they were created, who would have been creating them, but also
Mhm.
thinking about how do they work together with other documents.
Okay.
Like you were showing that deed earlier.
Mhm.
Well, okay, you have this deed, but obviously it's working in conjunction with some other records, that it's
True.
working in conjunction with what this executor is doing. So there are some records over here that we need to be looking
Mhm.
at too.
True.
So, and we see this like with naturalizations,
Okay.
that in some t- in some time periods that you would have, um, excuse me, you would have people going through the naturalization process, and it was a two-step process. That first you had to declare that you wanted to be naturalized, then you had to wait a certain amount of time, and then you would have to make your petition to actually become naturalized. So understanding that whole process
Mm.
and seeing that there are two different opportunities for records to be created there.
True.
So
True, true, true.
it's just a
Yeah,
matter of
and
oftentimes just slowing down.
right, right. And you wrote a lot about the naturalization process in that article that I mentioned earlier. It was called "How to Get Pull Clues from Genealogy Sources."
Mhm.
I know when I looked at the naturalization process for my German immigrant ancestor who doesn't have a lot of records, like
Yeah.
4, and then he passed away, and that was it. But I did have to look for each step in the process, the declaration of intent, and then the petition, although I don't think they actually had the petitions in the time frame he was choosing. So you have to actually then learn, probably your next point is, when was it created and what were the procedures they had.
Right.
I seem to remember they didn't create declaration of or petitions after their declaration. You did a declaration, you lived there 5 years, and then you came back and it was a court document with everybody that appeared and got naturalized that day. It's like, great, I was hoping for more.
Yeah, oftentimes that last step does not have a ton of detail in it,
True, true,
unfortunately.
very true. Okay, so we've covered a lot here. Is there anything else that you think, you know what, this is what I wish I knew when I first started out, and I'm so glad I know now?
You know, when it comes to records, I really think that a lot of it boils down to just slowing down.
Okay.
And because we get so excited, especially if it's a problem that we've been working on for a while. And
Mhm.
it's like, yay, this is the document that's going to tell me everything. Yay. And yeah, it might tell you that thing that you had been trying to find. But after you kind of come down from that high of, finding finding that thing you've been looking for 20 years, then thinking about, okay, really, what else is in here? What else can I pull out? One thing, and this is something that I do when I'm kind of stumped on where else can I look.
Mhm.
And this is going to sound really strange,
We
but
love strange.
I know. But look for verbs.
Okay.
Remember back in English class, and verbs are action words. Well,
Yes.
actions can create events.
Okay.
Events create records.
Okay.
So
Yes.
even just looking at the census and it says he owned land.
Mhm.
Well, if he owned land, should I be looking at land records?
True.
He was born in Virginia.
Mhm.
Well, can I follow up on some birth records in Virginia? But any document, when you're stumped, you're trying to figure out, what can I possibly look at next?
Mhm.
Get really, really, what's the word I'm looking for? Intentional.
Yes.
Be
I love
very
that word.
intentional as you're reading that whole document.
Mhm.
Be very careful how you're reading the document. It's like, okay, this is saying he is doing these things.
Mhm.
If he's doing these things,
Right.
did they create records?
True.
And then
True.
follow up with that.
Awesome. Such great tips. All right. So I'm going to turn the time over to the comment section for asking questions. So if you haven't asked a question already, now is the time to drop the question. And Amy is just such a wealth of knowledge. And I think questions are always going to be helpful. There were also a couple of tips that I wanted to pull up as well while you guys are thinking of your questions. Let me go up here for just a minute. Yeah, let's go ahead and start with this one here. This came in really early from one of our early birds, Stacy. About 2 weeks ago, when I was working on my newest family story, I pulled up a record for a marriage for a great aunt. The aunt was married by the minister of the people who did not split off to start the church that my family goes to. And it was a year after the split off. And two of his sons, one who married my grandma, served at my church. And so I really like that she was diving deeper into these different records. What else stands out to you as a really great clue that she found?
Well, I mean, the fact that she realizes that there was one church at one point and that it has split into two, which thinking about if you're trying to dive into more church records, that can make a big impact on where you're going to find those. If one of those churches no longer exists, if the congregation has closed, if they have split off into two, denominations, or, there was some sort of schism going on, if that congregation ever shut down, what happens to the records? What archive are they going to go to, if they even do that? Is that a thing that denomination does? So being really aware of what is going on in that church, and with that denomination in a more broad sense, can help you figure out where you might be able to track down more records.
True. And that leads me to the thought that I had. So going back to my German immigrant ancestor, so he was born in the Catholic Church of Columbus, into the Catholic cemetery. Well, I stumbled across this book that talked about the first Catholic cemetery in Columbus, Ohio. It's a little pamphlet at the Columbus Metropolitan Library. I picked it up, and it talked about that it doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
And they gave me this whole history of how the Catholic Church didn't really take care of that land, and they didn't properly document it and dedicate it, and it had been abandoned. So if it was abandoned, then how could you say you could keep it? And so in about 1880, so he died in 1863, about 40 years later, the city said, you need to get your dead and move them over to Holy Cross, or otherwise we're building a building on it. And people have been dead too long for anybody to reclaim. And I know my family was super, super poor because of all of those clues in the census records. It said that just didn't own very much money. And so I'm pretty confident, since he didn't get moved over to Holy Cross, that he was one that they kind of dug up.
And being a native of Columbus, I can tell you that was not the only cemetery that happened to. There were several city cemeteries that happened to. Yeah, North Market. If you ever come to Columbus and you have lunch at North Market, you're probably having lunch at the cemetery.
Right,
just
for sure,
a little fun fact. But that also, thinking about pulling out clues, if you're thinking about, okay, he was Catholic, I know he died, I suspect he was buried in this old Catholic cemetery. He may or may not have been moved to Holy Cross, or I would also look at Mount Calvary. That's another one to look at.
Right.
But thinking about, okay, if he's Catholic and he's buried in a Catholic cemetery, what church did he go to? What parish was he a member of? And then knowing, okay, he's German, so he's probably not a parishioner at St. Patrick's.
True. Yes.
Because St. Patrick's in Columbus, I mean, it sounds very stereotypical, but St. Patrick's in downtown Columbus was the very Irish parish.
Yes.
So that's probably not his. But again, it's thinking about all of these different ways that we can get this information to think about, what else can I look at? What else can I look for?
True. All right. We've got some more comments. I do apologize for all the flashes. I was trying to hit save and I wound up hitting show on screen, but all right. So there was no, that's not what he wanted to show, but I'll go ahead and share it. Circle back to documents. There was always rumors of my great grandmother's birth. Looking at the first paper that I did from 4th grade states where she was born. She was my source.
I love that. But that's a great thing that we all need to get into the habit of doing, is going back and reviewing what we already have, because what we're looking for, we might already have in our notes, but maybe when we put those notes together, we weren't thinking about that question, or we obviously didn't know everything then that we know now. So maybe going back to those old notes, suddenly it all makes sense now. So I love that example. That's awesome.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. I appreciate that. So here's another. Is it important to go to the courthouse in order to review the probate records?
It depends.
Just a minute. We have to laugh because that is like the most frequent statement we make here on Family History Fanatics. So if you're a loyal fan, it's time to put "it depends" or the little exclamation.
Yeah, I was gonna say we need hashtag "it depends." So because there are some courthouses, some counties that they have worked together really, really well with Family Search. Family Search has gone in and either microfilmed or digitized a ton of probate records in the United States and other countries as well. So some of them you might not really need to go to the courthouse. It's always fun if you can. But there are some counties that they haven't worked with anybody. They haven't worked with Family Search. They haven't worked with Ancestry. They haven't worked with their local genealogy society. They've done like nothing. So it just totally depends.
True. Yeah. And I remember working on a different family line, and I contacted, and I'm not from Ohio, so you can pick on me if you want.
Okay.
I believe it was called Huron County. Is that how you say it? Huron? Okay.
Yep, Huron.
So I called Huron County, and the probate people were just great. And it was really funny because I looked on Family Search, and this probate packet was missing in the digitized collection. So I said, hey, do you know what happened? I have the probate packet number from this, file. And they're like, they were in the process of digitizing it, put it on their own website. It was a couple years ago. I don't know exactly what wound up with it, but she's like, give me a week and then I'll go find it. And so she digitized everything and sent it to me. She's like, I found your missing packet. Yay! I was like, yay, it was so exciting. So just because it isn't online, right? And you do have a number, you can contact the courthouse because maybe it was MIA the day that the filming crew came by.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome.
Exactly. Awesome. Totally.
All right. So here's another one. I checked census records specifically for translation errors, right? Because you were talking about that earlier.
Yeah.
And then this was another tip. This is from Christopher. I think you're a newbie to our channel. Hey, Christopher. Check pages on either side as well. So you were having me zoom out so we could see all the neighbors. And then you picked up hey, there's all these English people. But if we go page forward, not just looking for names, what else should we be looking for when we go page forwards and back?
Well, anytime that we're looking at a census or anything, it's looking a page ahead, looking a page after. You really are getting more of a sense of that neighborhood. So is your person from England literally the only person in that entire township from England? Or is it he's in a very English neighborhood?
Right, true. True.
What you can start to see the occupations. Okay, what was sort of the culture like in that area? Are they very blue collar working class, or is this a neighborhood of a lot of professionals? You have the bankers and the attorneys, and that would not be the neighborhood that any of my ancestors lived in. But thinking about, I know, right? But it does give you a better sense of context.
True. Yeah, very true. Very true. All right. So that gave people plenty of time to pop in with some questions. So here you go.
All right.
Records that reference other records, tips, ? In Swedish records, I go from church records to death records to estate inventory. What would one do in U.S. records?
Well, if I'm looking at a death record in the United States, that's going to make me think about an obituary. It's going to make me think about cemeteries. When I'm thinking about cemeteries, then I'm going to be thinking about tombstones. I'm also going to be thinking about cemetery records. If they're buried at a church, I'm going to be thinking about church records, because there could be a completely different death record in that church than what is at the courthouse. It's also going to make me think about probate. It's also going to make me think about guardianships if there are any underage children. Even if one of the parents is still living, I'm going to be thinking about guardianship. So that's sort of my path of thinking with when I find a death record.
True. And I think it's also important that we understand the time and place in which we research, because I've been doing a lot of research in the U.S. Southwest. So this would be Colorado, Utah, Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, and California, and they don't all keep the same types of records at the same time. You also had you had the state of Deseret. Well, that's going to have a different record collection than when it became Utah Territory and different sections broke off. And so you have to know the time and place you're researching to know where to go. And there was also a time in Utah Territory history where marriages and probate records were then sent to the federal government because they were punishing that state for their polygamous practices.
Mhm.
And so it's like, oh, okay, now I need to know just like the history. Okay, if my ancestor was doing something in this time period, then it's probably going to be in a entirely different location. And so yeah, everything is about time and place. Would you say, do you have other examples where you're like, oh, you have to know this about a location?
Well, and in fact, that's actually what my video that I published this morning is about, is the importance of knowing when counties were created.
Mm-hmm.
Because so many of the records that we use are based upon location. Those census records, even though if it's a US census, it's still broken down by state and then by county. But things like tax records, vital records,
Mm-hmm.
probate records, other court records, land records, they're all based on that location.
Right.
So if I'm doing research in Noble County, Ohio,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm trying to move this line back, and I'm trying to find more records in Noble County, I'm not finding anything. Maybe it's because I'm trying to find records from 1840, but Noble County wasn't formed until 1851.
True. Very true.
So I need to know when Noble County was created and then what counties it was created from.
Mm-hmm. True.
So I know if I'm researching in Noble County, okay, if it's before 1851, I need to be looking in Morgan and Monroe and Washington, and I think that there's a fourth one in there. But that's when I go to the Family Search Wiki, and that will is that another one?
That is my favorite.
I know that is. When I do Q&A sessions in my membership, that's. They put me on a timer. How long will Amy go before she mentions the Family Search Wiki? So
yes,
but being able to pull up when a county was created and what counties it was created from, that's going to save you so much frustration later on.
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
And Patricia's just pointing out there's lots of creations in North Carolina and Georgia. So very true.
Yeah.
Very true.
Most states did not become states with all of their counties completely formed.
True.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, Hawaii did. Alaska really doesn't necessarily have counties, but they have census districts. And I think that there are a couple other states that their counties were actually in place when they became states, but the vast majority of them did not. So chances are you're going to be dealing with county boundary changes at some point.
Right. And I also was studying New Mexico, and New Mexico and Texas don't like each other, and I've lived in both, so it's kind of funny. But there's a few counties that kept swapping back and forth between the states because the states kept fighting over the border that where New Mexico was going to be. And so knowing your border, sometimes it's in Texas and sometimes it's in New Mexico. So it's all crazy. The counties were formed; it just kept changing between the states as they kept battling it out.
But it makes a difference in where you're going to be looking for those records.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So this is from Chris. Hi, Chris. My cousin is going to the old ancestral town of San Pietro. I hope I said that right, in July. What question should I ask my cousin to check out but not overwhelm her?
Ooh, good question. I would think first about what it is you're trying to find out.
Okay.
I would probably see if she could go to if you know what church they went to, and see if that church has any records that you might not have access to online. I mean, you don't want to send her looking at records that you could pull up on Family Search.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, I would try to get in mind a good question at first. And then think about, is this something that I really cannot answer with the resources I have, that it really needs to be on site? So I think it really depends on what it is you're trying to discover.
True. Yeah. And I also want to drop here in the comments real quickly. So my friend Alessandro from Bella Italia, he is a wealth of information on Italy. And you might want to reach out to him and say, hey, we're going here. What would you recommend? Because he knows Italy so well. It is his passion and it's his business. I would just go ahead and ask him, what should we be looking for, and maybe get some feedback from him, and then tell him Devin said hi from Family History Fanatics, and he'll help you out.
Yeah, that's a great resource.
I love Alexander. Alice. I keep saying it wrong. Alessandro. Okay, here's the next question. Terry, I'm struggling with finding any information from Puerto Rico. Supposedly my parents were married there, but finding nothing. Can find directory info ?
Supposedly my birth parents were married there. Family Search Wiki. And I know that sounds very flippant, but
no, it's not flippant. I'm laughing because I'm pulling that up right now.
Yeah, well, because it might give you some insight as to where marriage records in Puerto Rico were actually recorded.
Mm-hmm.
Sure. Is that more of a civil thing, or is that a church thing?
Mm-hmm.
And that, because that can make a huge difference on where they're going to be recorded. Also, if they were members, if one of them was in the military, would they have had to go through the same process that a Puerto Rican citizen would have done? So if it just happened to be that one of them was in the military and they were stationed in Puerto Rico, I don't know, but I would definitely go to the Puerto Rico page on the Family Search Wiki, and if I can see, try to find out for that time period, where were they actually recording marriages?
Yep. I almost always go to the Family Search Wiki because it just has so many other resources. And if they don't have an answer, they often have links to other websites that might have answers for you. So for me, it's like the gateway drug of deeper genealogy. So census record is the gateway to genealogy records, and then Family Search is the gateway to deeper records. I don't know.
Yeah.
All right. We've got another great, here's a question from Patricia. Hey, Patricia. She's my 9th cousin.
Ooh.
Where do you find future baptisms, marriage, burials, etc.? And I'm not sure what the future was. I think there might have been a follow-up.
So if we just take the word future out and just where do you find baptisms, marriages, burials, etc., it's really going to depend upon the church and the denomination. So thinking about, okay, let's just say for example, let's say they were Catholic.
Mm-hmm.
Well, those baptism records, the marriage record, the church marriage records, the church death and maybe burial records would be held at the parish level. So that's going to be the church.
Mm-hmm.
When that parish, if that parish ever closes, what is supposed to happen is that those records are then supposed to be transferred to the archive for the whole diocese. Now, in the Catholic faith, you have individual churches, which are the parishes, and then a big group of parishes is a diocese. And that's like the next level up in the bureaucracy.
Mm-hmm.
So that's where the records were supposed to go if a parish would ever close.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to not necessarily be the same procedure for other denominations.
Mm-hmm.
Churches that, some churches that don't have a very hierarchical structure, they don't necessarily transfer. Well, one, they don't necessarily keep really detailed records.
True.
But two, they don't necessarily have a main sort of hub where things go. So sometimes, again, depends completely upon the denomination, but it actually could end up that the records just stayed with whoever the last minister happened to be.
Yeah.
Sometimes they would get transferred to a neighboring congregation of the same faith. They might have been transferred to a historical society, and that could be a local historical society or a state historical society. It just, one thing to do when you are trying to track down church records, if you know what church you're interested in and you're not having success, I mean, if the church like no longer exists, contact the Genealogy Society in that area, because chances are that Genealogy Society knows what happened to the records.
Yeah, true. I did I only found this out because I was looking at a probate record, that there was not a probate record, Civil War pension file. And there was a lady who was attesting to the marriage of the couple, because it was before marriage records were kept at the state level or the county level. And she testified, according to my father's records that I now have because he's deceased.
Nice.
This is when the couple got married. So I mean, that's good. That's like stabbing in the dark, right? Like tracking down on the relatives. Did anybody keep dead religious records? But
that's awesome.
For sure. And
but it does make you wonder, what happened to them? Where are they now?
Right, for sure, for sure. Divine intervention from the divinely kept records, right?
Exactly.
So, all right, so let's go to the next one. Do all births and deaths create records? I know Catholics do. What about before 1850 and what became Canada?
So when we're thinking about death records, and really any vital record, which would be birth, marriage, or death, there are really kind of two types. You have the civil record, which is what the government keeps. And then you may or may not have a religious record. So it's going to depend, if you're thinking about religious records, it's going to depend upon the denomination and, you know, what they kept. There are some denominations that, you know, record keeping just really is not their thing. Then you have the Catholic Church where, yeah, they're supposed to keep these records, but oftentimes how detailed they were depended upon how detail-oriented the pastor at that parish really was.
True.
And it can also depend upon what language he decided to record them in. Yay. I have literally seen Catholic Church records where on the same page, they have been in English and German and Latin. And I love the records that are in German and Latin, and it's all in the same record. And because just about the time you realize, oh, he's writing in Latin, then he switches back to German. Really? Can you not just pick a language and stick with it for one baptism record? But it's really a matter of understanding that location and that time period to see what might exist for civil records. Again, that's what the government's keeping, as opposed to what is going on with the various religious organizations and what they might be keeping. So it's just going to depend.
Yeah, it's going to give us an opportunity. So one really great thing about Canadian census records is they often put the religion that people practiced. So I know my Canadians were United Brethren. So now I need to go research just United Brethren in general to find out if they were a record-keeping denomination. Because as you mentioned before, not all denominations kept good records, and not all denominations kept records. And so then I would have to do that. And once I have that answer, then I could go and try to find you know, what churches served the area. Thankfully, almost everybody was from this little bitty town in Gainsborough called Elko, and the church is still there. And they've done a really, really good job of archiving the cemetery that's right outside the church, because it was a small community, you know. Their records are a little bit sketchy, so I have to turn over to the civil registration records. But you know, when I finally retire and I can work on my Canadians further, I'll dive in. But I do know it all depends, because I know that I have relatives who are a part of non-record keeping churches. And so I'm never going to find a record there, because they just never kept records.
They just didn't, it just wasn't part of what their faith required.
Yep. Okay. Next question. We're going to take maybe 2 more questions before we wrap it up. We'll see how far it goes. This is the next question. I'm giving Amy a chance to read it real quick, and then I'll read it. Any suggestion on locating documents for a state hospital? This comes up a lot. Or records during that I can use for alternative documents when he was institutionalized? Asylum and institution records are probably the most asked questions in genealogy forum.
And this is a topic that really hits home for me, because I have an ancestor who I was trying to track down where and when she died literally for more than 20 years. It was probably closer to 30 that I had been trying to find what happened to Matilda de Bolt Skinner Cross and Brown McFillin. And I finally found her just in the last year, I think. It's fairly recent. What is time anymore? But I found that she died in 1899 in the East Illinois State Hospital in Kankakee. Even though she has been dead for 123 years, to have any of her hospital records released, I have to get a judge in Illinois to order those records opened, even though she's been dead for 123 years. Yeah. So that kind of stinks. So one thing that we can do, though, is, okay, the hospital records, and some states are open. Illinois is not. Ohio, maybe. It depends. Depends on the time period in Ohio. So one, don't just assume that it's going to be closed, because there are a handful of states where the records are actually open. But other than looking at the actual hospital records, you could be, if you know what county he would have been committed from, look in those county court records.
Okay.
Now, it might have been a probate matter. It might have been a civil matter. It depends upon the jurisdiction, what court would have handled something like that. So look at court records for that area. Surprisingly, those are often open, because they in most places, they don't just exclude, oh, this happens to be a mental case, so it gets pulled. Usually it's in with all the rest of them. Shh, you didn't hear that from me. So look at those local court records. Look at local newspapers, because when that court proceeding would have been determined, and yeah, this person is going to be sent to the state hospital, usually most newspapers will have a recap of the rulings by the court, and it might just be a couple of lines, but usually there's a sort of a recap of, this week at the court, here are all the legal matters that were decided.
Yes.
So look at that.
That's why you're getting a big head nod. Yes, I've seen that.
Yes. And one other thing to look at also are the annual reports of that institution.
Yes.
And those annual reports, a surprising number of them are online on Google Books and also on Internet Archive.
Yes.
These are going to be government documents that because it's a state institution, they had bureaucracy actually works for us sometimes. And this is one of those instances where they had to create a report every single year. And that report would usually get filed at either the state library, state archive, state historical society. Now, you're probably not going to find your ancestor mentioned by name. But when you're reading these annual reports, you're getting that sense of context. It's like, okay, we had to rebuild the women's ward of the dormitory because there was a fire last year. Or we had an outbreak of cholera and 17 people died in the last year. You can see a lot of times they will have a recap of the illnesses, or I should say the reasons why people were committed to that hospital. They're not going to be usually mentioned by name, but you can get a sense of why were people here. And so looking at those annual reports, again, you're probably not going to find your ancestor mentioned by name, but they are so great for context. I've even seen sample menus in there. That this is our menu for the week, just a sample menu. Here are the activities that we're doing. Here is sort of the things that we're doing with the men, that they're doing these trades or whatnot. They're really, really great sources for understanding what life was like in those hospitals.
Absolutely. Here's a quick tangent question, or related question. That's what I'm trying to say. Columbus State Hospital. Do you have any idea where those are?
The Ohio History Connection in Columbus.
There you go.
Yep.
There you go. I knew you would know that one right off the top of your little noggin.
Yes.
Okay, so here's the last one we have from Kathy. If someone is born in a wagon while moving, is there a chance of finding a birth record? Her birth date is listed as 8 January 1888, Pumpkin Creek, Montana. Now,
That's a great place name.
I'm going to throw in one little caveat. If they happen to be in the Ohio Pioneer, or not Ohio, the LDS Pioneer tracks, they have company reports, and they will talk about who left the corralling station and who migrated, who lived, who was born, who got married on the entire journey. And so if it's in that kind of pioneer company, there are those records, and they're through the BYU Family Church History Library, not necessarily over on Family Search, but Family Search sometimes connects in. But I know that I did see reports like that where people were getting married and people died and people were born on the trip, and they're in the company report. So the first thing you try to find out is what company they were in, and there is an overland trail database dedicated to that. If they're not, take it away, Amy, because I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, and that's one of those, it's, you know, if you're trying to make your way west and I mean, okay, and first, can we just talk about the fact of giving birth while you're on a trek like that? I cannot even imagine. Oh my gosh. I'm thinking that probably getting that birth recorded is probably not top of mind. But I would take a look to see when were civil birth records actually required in Montana. But if it's just that they happen to be passing through, yeah, but I would see when they're recorded, but that sounds like one of those that I wouldn't hold out a ton of hope.
Yeah, this is a follow-up from Kathy. I hadn't thought if her grandfather was active, but no. Grandfather was active, but not sure about the dad. Yeah, go ahead. Just do a Google search. It's called the Overland Pioneer Trails, and it will bring you to all the resources and database. Anybody who crossed the plains in the LDS Pioneer companies, their names are listed on there. And then you will find out what the company is, and then you can go to the BYU Church Family History Library and look for that. They usually tell you where to go next on that, if I remember correctly. I was researching the Lamborns, and that's how I came across that stuff. It was new to me, which comes to a cute point from Road to Family History. Always keep learning, right? Always keep learning. And so I like to go and pick a state and pick a family and research them. And just build my chops. Like, all right, what is it like to research in Colorado? What's it like to research in New Mexico? New Mexico, you have to know Spanish.
It helps.
You did have to know Spanish. So I took a little bit of Spanish, and it's helping a little bit, but not much.
Every little bit
Thankfully,
helps.
there's cheat sheets that, whatever. But always keep learning is a great tip. What final tip would you have to wrap it up on how to get more clues out of our research projects?
I think
records.
Yeah, I think if I had just one clue to sort of wrap it up is to go slow.
Okay.
Take your time. Don't just skim. Really take your time, get to know that record, read it, understand it, learn more about it if you have to. If there's something in that record you don't quite understand, instead of just guessing, go out, use resources like the Family Search Wiki and see if you can find an answer so you can better understand that record. Because if you're not understanding the record, you're really not going to understand what it's telling you.
That's so true. Well, thank you, Amy, for all the great tips that you have. If you haven't already, go find Amy's channel. The link is in the description. Now,